are joined by the reporter who was covering this particular story, that's Tshegohaco Moagi, who has been covering this particular story. We are also joined by former journalist Leigh-Anne Jansen, who covered the Henri van Breda case, and that was the case of another family that was essentially wiped out by a family member. We're also joined in studio by Dr Gerard Labuschagne, someone who has a way of getting into the minds of those accused of such heinous crimes. Doctor, thank you very much for making the time to be here as well. Can I start with you, Tshego? You have been covering the Onthatile Sebati case. What came out strongly for you, or what would you say have been the highlights around this case? You would have heard me earlier discussing with the uncle as to what the motive for these murders would have been. We know that she is out on bail. There is no conviction yet. All of that is going to be ventilated in court. But what have you heard thus far?
Well, good morning, Xoli. So one of the interesting things that we heard in court was during the testimony of the investigating officer, of course, because she confessed to these murders. The big thing as well being around how did she actually stay for so long without saying anything to anyone about these murders, why she did them, and why was she the one that actually orchestrated these killings. But in her confession to the investigating officer, she did say that she felt like, as you heard when in your question to Uncle Donald Brown, she did say that she felt like she needed freedom from her parents, and her parents were overbearing. And that's why she then committed these murders. The interesting thing as well was that she wanted for her younger brother not to be killed. So he was accidentally killed, from what we've heard in court. The two Mokone cousins, Tumelo and Kagiso Mokone, they are cousins, and they have said that they are innocent. They plan on pleading not guilty. But in her testimony, Onthatile, or in her confession, Onthatile has actually given them, she has given her names their names to the police. So that is something that is quite interesting as to how things will then unfold in that instance. Another interesting thing was how their attorneys, of course, during the bail application, trying to reason with the court about why they should be released on bail. We heard very little from Onthatile's advocate, but the other two, obviously just talking around the issue of them being the ones that handed themselves over to the police. Yes, the police officers did go look for them at their homes, but they then handed themselves over the following day or so to the police. That was the main argument that was given, that they were cooperating with the police, and one of the reasons why they should be released on bail. Yeah. So with Onthatile Sebati specifically, her advocate really just speaking around why she should be released on bail. But it is quite interesting that she still provided the same address where her family died, where these murders actually took place. So this is where she'll be living if she's able to post this 10,000 Rand bail. That's where she'll then be going back to that home. And when I spoke to Donald yesterday, Donald Brown, he did mention that when the money started running out, the money from the inheritance, she then started calling him for assistance with food and other necessities that she actually had. So it will also be quite interesting to see how she will continue life, or how she will live, if she's able to post this 10,000 Rand bail. She had initially said, Xoli, in her bail application that she can only afford 1,000 Rand. This, of course, a person that is currently getting the estate, the money. This is how she says she's currently living, that she's still receiving money from her parents' estate.
Leigh-Anne Jansen, let's bring you into the conversation, former journalist, and the reason we've brought you here is that you covered the Henri van Breda case very extensively at the media house you and I were employed. And from what Tshego is relating here, are you able to find any similarities to the case of Henri van Breda and what the possible motive could have been? And I'm placing the Sibati case on the side, but just on Henri van Breda. Are there any striking similarities you are finding here?
Well, the main similarity I'm finding at the moment is the issue of money. So while motive was never proven in the Henri van Breda, the trial of Henri van Breda, it was alleged, though, that he was a crystal meth addict and that his benefits would be stripped. That his father had told him that his benefits would be stripped, and that was the reason for his breakdown, so to speak, and for committing this savage crime, a triple murder and attempted murder of his sister Marley. So for now, that is the striking similarity I'm finding between the case that Tshego is following and the case of the triple murder of the Van Breda family.
What about relations with the siblings, Leigh-Anne? I asked the uncle about whether or not he remembers of the relationship between Onthatile and the two siblings that were murdered here. You heard Tshego talking about how the brother was accidentally murdered. Henri van Breda, there seems to have been somewhat of a tense relationship between Henri and, in particular, his brother. Do you remember anything around that?
Yes, there was a somewhat tense relationship between Henri van Breda and his brother Rudy. And all this stemmed from his apparent drug addiction, and that it was causing all kinds of chaos in the household and making the household unstable and creating unhappiness there as well. So there was that tension between Henri and Rudy, but there's also Marley van Breda. While she was diagnosed with retrograde amnesia following the axe attack, we don't quite know exactly what their relationship was like, other than what we've heard, that it was kind of okay, and that Marley, though, had issues with her parents as well. But none of that as well had been proven in court in his trial. But we do know, as you'd asked, that Henri and his brother Rudy had somewhat of a tense relationship, simply because they were brothers, and Henri was causing all kinds of drama in the household with his alleged drug addiction.
All right. I'm going to ask you, colleagues, to stay exactly where you are, because when we return, we're going to ask Dr. Gerard Labuschagne, the criminologist here, to make sense of this for us, and importantly, whether these cases are on the rise in the country. We'll continue in a moment. You're watching Newsfeed AM, and we're discussing the matter of family murders, and it's on the back of the Onthatile Sebati murder case. She is accused of hiring people to murder not just her mother and father, but siblings as well. And we've also brought up another case that was recently heard in court, 2015. The Van Breda family that was murdered, and coming out of that case, the person convicted was actually the son, Henri, who was convicted of all the murders, the mother, the father, and the brother. All right, let's bring into the conversation now the criminologist, but also someone who is going to help us to get into the minds of the children who do these things. You also a psychologist, Dr. Labuschagne. You have heard the background that we have sought to paint to the viewer, stretching it from the case of the Van Breda family, and then more recently the one that's before court now. It's got to do with Onthatile Sebati. What drives children to do these things? And I say children, maybe I'm not using the correct word here, but they were not necessarily children when they do these things. Henri van Breda, he carried out the murders, and we can say that with a certain amount of conviction, because he was convicted of actually murdering his entire family, except, of course, the sister who survived, with an axe. What are you able to tell us about that case and help us understand the one that's currently before court?
Well, obviously, I mean, in this case, as in terms of their family position, they are the children. I mean, it doesn't matter whether they're 18, 20, 30, etc. They're killing their parents. So it's a form of family murder. In some instances, you might get one parent be murdered, but these are obviously instances where we're talking about the rest of the remaining family, typically, that's been taken out. It's a bit unusual that there's a daughter involved. We typically would see it's one of the sons. The Lotter family in Durban that were murdered many years ago, it was the son, the daughter, and the daughter's boyfriend. So that's kind of also one that stands out. But if you look at the Van Breda case, the Kriekwestad case, there's a case in the Twatwa a couple of years ago, Lester Abrams in Johannesburg a couple of years ago. It's typically going to be one of the sons that commits the murder. The kind of average age that we see is kind of anything from the youngest one is about 14 years old in South Africa, around about 16 there's quite a few, and then of course you get a few that kind of in the early 20s, like from Breda, Lester Abrams, which were more adults and out the home sometimes in some cases.
And Doc, you mentioned that the driving force, though, or the motive for these, in the Lotter case, money was involved, because I think the boyfriend would have influenced their daughter, and then in came the other sibling who was a boy. Henri van Breda, it's no secret that he was spending big time before he was finally caught, and so money would have been the motive there as well. The current case, you have heard our reporter suggesting that money does seem to be a very strong point coming out of court. The uncle, even though he says, look, I might not be exactly 100%, but we do know that the mother and father were running businesses as well. So money is a motive. Is it a common thread? Yeah, I mean, you cannot sort of avoid staring at the fact that in many of these cases, specifically the Kriekwestad case, Don Steenkamp's murder, they murdered his parents and brother, and the Van Breda case, they stood to inherit millions, and that cannot just be ignored. So money in itself would never be the only explanation. Otherwise, any parent who's wealthy would have to fear their children. So there always has to be something there that would make that individual do it. But as I said, you cannot get around the fact that many of these children were going to inherit sometimes a significant amount of money, or even in this case, it seems like Onthatile enough to survive a couple of years if she's still surviving on the estate. So that's for someone who maybe is not in the most sort of, is a bit more impoverished sort of side of the spectrum. I mean, even a few 100,000 is a hell of a lot of money for someone in those circumstances. So you can't ignore that. We typically would say that, if you look at a typology, you get children who are very severely abused by the parents, who might take steps against them. You get those who have severe mental illness, who might be reacting upon that mental illness and do this. And then sort of the third general category is your more antisocial, possibly psychopathic types of children. And in that category, you do find things like, the financial rewards, selfish reasons, wanting freedom are often kind of what's central in those situations. Dr. Gerard Labuschagne, thank you very much for painting this for us. Let's wrap up the conversation with you colleagues as well. Tshegohaco, let's come back to you. The kind of impact that this case has had on the community, briefly for us, please, if you can.
Well, Paul, it's interesting, that we hear from Dr. Labuschagne around the issue of the need for freedom, which is something that we heard in court as well. But there hasn't been a huge impact on the community, something that was also mentioned in court. And I'd just also like to mention, just picking up on some of the pointers that Dr. Labuschagne has just mentioned, the issue around the murders that actually took place in 2016. We understand that Onthatile led these two men into her home, and she then decided that she's going to point them out where to start. They started with the father. He was sitting at a sitting area counting money. She then decided that that's the first person that will be shot, with accused number 3, who's Kagiso Mokone. And then the sister came out of her bedroom and she then got shot. The mom heard the commotion, of course. She then walked out of the bedroom to see what was happening. And when she saw her daughter with Kagiso Mokone, she then closed the door immediately. And we understand that after a few minutes, she then decided to say to her mom, "No, mom, it's safe. Come back out. They have left." And that's when, as soon as the mom opened, that's when the shots were then fired, and she was with the little brother. The community, of course, in 2016 really outraged at what had taken place. It was initially an issue of they thought that it was random people who were there to steal, because some of the money had been stolen, the car had been stolen, and of course the firearm that belonged to Onthatile's dad, who was of course a police officer. At the time, a lot of outrage that had of course come out. But now much more calmer. I mean, we were expecting at some point to see some kind of protest action around the court, but none of that happened during the bail application. Even yesterday during the judgment, none of that coming out of court. And this was one of the things that was brought about by the attorneys, that there has not been any community outrage or uproar over the arrest of these 3 murder accused. The court was very full, however, but most of the people that were there were family members and very few community members that were there. So although there is a lot of shock within the Makau family and the Makau community, there isn't a lot of uproar that we have seen during this bail application.
Leigh-Anne Jansen, very briefly from your end, the Henri van Breda case was a headline-grabbing story. What do you remember of the impact that it had?
It had a huge impact, Xoli, and let me just give you this interesting bit of information that today is the 7th anniversary of that triple murder incident. It sent shockwaves throughout the country. Also on the estate that they lived, it was the De Zalze Golf Estate, an upmarket luxury golf estate in Stellenbosch. The people who lived there are multimillionaires and didn't expect something like this to happen on their estate. Now it's like Tshegohaco said, it's died down. Henri is serving his sentence. He lost his appeal bid at the Supreme Court of Appeal. So he's currently serving 3 life terms, 15 years for attempted murder and 1 for obstructing the administration of justice. So everything now has died down. But at the time, it was a huge story. Many people questioning why he had done it. You'd remember, Xoli, I had gotten my hands on the emergency call that he had made hours after the murders, in which it sounded as though he had giggled after saying that his family was attacked by a man with an axe. And that itself sent shockwaves across the country among interested parties in this case, per se.
Leigh-Anne Jansen, former journalist, thank you very much for taking us back memory lane. Tshegohaco Moagi, thank you very much for your contributions and indeed telling the ongoing story of Onthatile Sebati. And of course, in studio here, Dr. Gerard Labuschagne, psychologist. Thank you very much.